And good evening. It's April 24th, 2024, and welcome to one of our Branches on the Vine with the Bible Project and the Sermon on the Mount series. So, the Bible Project created this series to cover the entire year. Every 5 weeks, they're going to release another episode. We're going to take the time to discuss each of those episodes and some creative topics that they presented in between. The videos that we're going to be discussing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and they all can be found on the Bible Project app. Link in the description. So welcome this evening to a discussion on one of the additional topics discussed in the series from Weekly Playlist 14, Fulfilling the Ancient Torah. This might stretch us a bit, and it might even add some more context to the discussion tonight on The Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, ask me to click that subscribe button. The reminders, they're just there to help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, ask me to click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So this Sermon on the Mount, again, is found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And for me, it's the seminal moment in the teachings of Jesus. This is his longest, deepest, widest teaching that we have recorded in all of Scripture. It covers things that we, for sure, we like to talk about, yet deep down, we really have challenges living. So the Sermon on the Mount, from Weekly Playlist 14, Fulfilling the Torah. Let's take a listen. Enjoy.
Okay, so this is Israel.
Yeah.
They have the Torah and the prophets, which is for them the sacred writings that tell them who they are
Yeah.
and why God
Yeah.
selected them and their mission to then be a priesthood, a kingdom,
Yeah.
bring blessing to the nations.
And the revelation of that covenant, it came with 600 plus commands, ancient commands
In the Torah.
in the Torah that are now, by Jesus' time, over 1,000 years old. So
Yeah.
they're ancient by Jesus' time. In Jesus' day, different Jewish groups are arguing and disagreeing, splitting, playing power politics with what version of obedience truly fulfills all of the commands of the Torah. In other words, Jesus is one voice among many voices saying, this is the real way to be faithful to the God of Israel, fulfill the Torah commands in this way.
So there's all these commands in the Torah.
Yeah.
But they're 1,000 years old. They assume that you're living in a very specific time
Yeah.
and place.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as just like do all of these commands.
No.
It leaves a bunch of questions.
That's right. The cultural context has already shifted radically by Jesus' day.
Yeah.
First century Israel-Palestine under Roman occupation is a very different setting from, the early Israelites living in the hill country as a tribal federation of farming communities.
But these are the commands that,
Yes.
that they were given to be faithful to the covenant.
Yes. So different Jewish teachers and groups had to find ways to create principles that transcended the ancient cultural context and bridged and connected into their first century context. And people disagreed about how to do that.
Yeah, because as soon as you're principalizing, then you're
interpreting. Yeah.
And so there's going to be disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, they're treating these laws as wisdom literature.
Correct. That's right.
The Pharisees are one group of people doing this.
Yes. Yeah.
And the Sadducees are another.
Yeah. Pharisees, they would be the equivalent of a populist, hyper-conservative movement that is trying to live as literally as possible by the original commands of the Torah as stated.
Okay.
So much so that even the commands that were given only to a select few Israelites, the priests, they have created principles out of that they say apply to all of the people. So that what the priests used to do in the temple, every Israelite family is to do in their home. Of washing rituals, washing your hands, food rituals. And there are a lot of other Jews that think that's just unnecessary, like the Sadducees. The Sadducees have a different take on a lot of those rules. And the Sadducees, which was essentially named for the priestly ruling class, they're the ones who have brokered a peace deal with Rome, and Rome lets them look like they're in charge. There was a spectrum of differences from hyper-Torah observance to, hey, let's build a Colosseum, and maybe the men don't really need to get circumcised after all. And so the whole point is that it's a tumultuous time. Everybody's who's trying to gain influence is arguing about how to remain faithful to the will of the God of Israel in these new and trying times.
To have any authority as an Israelite leader,
Yep.
you have to explain what your position is on how you fulfill the covenant terms.
That's right. And remember, the covenant terms were always about God's mission to make one group of people a kingdom of priests. This is what God says to Israel when he invites them into a covenant on Mount Sinai, Exodus 19. So a kingdom of representatives who will represent God's character to the world and represent the nations before God. That's the point.
Lights of the world.
Yeah, to be a city on a hill.
City on a hill.
And so how you fulfill those commands then becomes job number one. And that's what Jesus says he's here to do, is
to fill them full.
Exactly, to fulfill them.
Yeah, that's the
normal English translation. So some people might look at what I'm teaching, which you haven't heard yet, but you're about to, and say, I'm dismantling the Torah. No, I'm saying that all those other people are wrong. And what I'm here to do is fulfill the Torah and prophets. So Jesus views the scriptures as something that points forward. It has a set of texts that create momentum and expectation, a conflict that needs to be resolved in some way. And that's how Jesus reads his Bible, as a unified story that needs resolution. And what he's claiming here is, I am here to provide the resolution to which the Torah and the prophets are pointing.
So, what'd you think? If you've been around with me on the Dusty Feet long enough, you're going to know that the big three that I like to look into are context, connection, and community. So I'm looking at these, and I try to view a lot of what we look at through these lenses. And I like to involve those three ideas. So within that idea, I try to look at context first as one of my stronger points. Because if I can set or think about or consider context, then it will aid in the connection, right? There's a logic to that. And then from there, then how do we apply that? How does that relate to community? How do we do that living together? So, starting with the context question, part of me likes to go to terms, right? We need to kind of set up a starting point as to what I mean when I'm using the words that I'm using. Is that fair? I'm looking to say, if I use the words that we can both come at to from a different paradigm thought, that we approach the word differently, so I understand that. But if I'm trying to make a point, it's probably fair for me to tell you what I think, at least from my personal perspective, what those terms are and how they fit in my context view. Fair? So let's start with a few that we're looking at in relation to Torah. And maybe it'll help us when we're looking at Jesus' interactions and expectations from there. Yeah? So terms. Torah, priests, authority, service. So let's go with, I'm very comfortable with Tim and John's use of the word Torah, right? I'm very comfortable with how they're viewing Torah. As Tim and John go on that the Torah, for a lot of things, has truly become more wisdom literature. I'll buy that. But I expect that we kind of need to add some framework, right? I think that maybe a little expansion or explanation would be helpful. So Torah, in its original form, was designed to be a constitution. It was designed to be a founding document, a founding set of guidelines, of instructions. These are for the expectations of the people, both in the desert and then, those 40 years that they traveled, and then inside the land that God was eventually going to give them. And like Tim and John say, and again I agree, the Torah is not an all-inclusive document, that it's a framework, kind of similar to our American or any other constitution from any country. That frameworks, they're built upon foundations. I like frameworks because it is a framework, which means you build a framework on a foundation. So the foundation, those are those core tenets, right? The foundation that sets up the framework for success. Yeah. So there's 613 pieces of this framework, but really they're supported by the Big Ten. And even more in Jesus' time, because he boils it down that the foundation is the top two. All of the other framework has to sit on that foundation. So I'm going to use this term, principles, because they used it. So I kind of want to address it because it's going to be something we're going to look into deeper later, but I liked it. And so I like the word that John used. I'm not 100% sure it's even an actual word, is principalizing. Yeah. Taking something that has a practical aspect or context, and then when that context has changed, using the reason behind the practice to influence future behavior. The context has been altered. Let's use a Torah example, right? You need to poop. And in Torah, in the camp, you're supposed to bring a small tool like a hand trowel, and you go out to the edge of camp, outside camp, and you bury it. So that's a very practical, safe, important practice, right? We now do it differently because the original context has been altered. It doesn't exist. What it was designed for, that's no longer. Because we, the vast majority of us anyways, on a daily basis, do not bring a small shovel to bury our poop outside. Possibly a principalizing practice of maybe how our sewer system works. Well, you're starting to get the picture. So we're building on our comfortable terms. So let's go to priest, okay? Because there mentioned something there that I find interesting, and Tim and John addressed it, so it's worth discussing, is authority in priests. So again, going back into Torah, in the roles and design of the priests, they are not authority figures in context. They are not the rulers of the day. The high priest was never the ruler and the authority figure. Priests are serving people. They had tasks that they were required to do for the people. And then how they were taken care of, that was through God, by the people. Kind of a loop. We do have a discussion in Torah that goes to the judges, right? These are the people that are expected to handle conflict resolution. I like that. And any ultimate conflict that could not be resolved, then yes, came the high priest for resolution. But it's interesting to remember. Remember, in that context, Moses was the leader. Joshua became the leader afterwards as we transitioned out of the desert and into the land. Yeah. Aaron, he was in charge of the priests. His job as high priest, he dealt with those priestly duties, and he eventually, that the role of the high priest was involved in the ultimate resolution of a subject. Yeah. It's interesting because it really wasn't even really his choice, really, right? The Urim and the Thummim. Many have possibly not heard of those. They are part of the breastplate of the high priest, of Aaron, right? And all of his descendants. The the Urim and the Thummim, they were a priestly device for obtaining words from God. On the high priest ephod, that was the apron-like garment, lays a breastplate. And in this pouch is inlaid with 12 precious stones, engraved with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And in that held were the Urim and the Thummim. By means of this, the high priest inquired of Yahweh on behalf of the ruler, because only the king, the high court, or someone serving in need of the community, they were the three legitimate means of obtaining these oracles from God. This breastpiece was often referred to as the breastpiece of decision. Right? The high priest was not part of the regular conflict resolution panel. It was just in cases of no resolution that he had a function. But it's not an authority figure. It's passing on the authority of God's decision. Because we needed that difference, because this is not the practice that the priestly leadership in Jesus' day were operating under. So maybe that could be what Jesus is addressing at different times with this, that these priests were taking on roles of authority that were not theirs to take. And that included mandating how things were to be done. If you didn't do it our way, then you're wrong. But the role is for priests to serve, to maintain God's space, right? The tabernacle or the temple. And then also to act as the intermediary for the sacrifices to God brought by the people, right? He is representing the people as they brought forth the sacrifices to the altar. And since all the priestly functions literally in the land in relation to the temple, currently, right, they have no practical context, then the rest of our thoughts would have to be then principalizing. But just to keep us humble, because priests wanting to be important, viewed with esteem, we only need to peek at the Korah's rebellion in Numbers chapter 16. It will keep one humble indeed as a priest. It's not a pretty story, but it's important to know. Please go check it out. That said, the priest is there to serve. And I think that we've moved forward in time, the priests have become more of a broker. That never should have been, because those are the guys that Jesus literally went to town on the last week in Jerusalem. God's intention on priesthood for service in the original design. I'm going to throw in, if we choose to align ourselves as followers of this God of Abraham, that priests, we're all supposed to be a priest to the nations, to serve the nations. This nation of priests, this group of priests, is to serve the nations. So not everybody on the planet is a priest. Those that have this role, then what a priest does, and we have to start with the original context and all of the principalizing later, we'll still have to deal with being prepared to serve. Because that will be a very large part and a very in-depth part of the context going forward, especially as we get to the parables inside. So we get that far down the road. We're starting looking at Torah. We're principalizing it. It's actually a good word. I find it creative, and it gives us a lot of other points to think about. But I think we forget that we need to remember that a large portion of the Hebrew population at this time, the Jewish population, is still also scattered around. They're in the diaspora, as we call it. So ruling is really not in their daily scenario. At least being ruled, yes. Being in charge, probably not so much. But God still has them. I'll even entertain the thought of us being in a very different capacity, and it will show itself more as we continue through this Sermon on the Mount. You know, Jesus does call us to be a light, to be an example, to be a guide to something. You know, like like a beautiful lighthouse to a seashore, to be a light for all to see. Although, maybe at times we think of us as maybe just little scattered lights. So I'm going to use an analogy from a movie that has probably the capability to divide the room, right? That's not my intent. And if you've not seen it, then it might be hard to relate. So I'm going to do my best to explain. There's a scene in Harry Potter after Dumbledore dies. The school is devastated that Dumbledore is dead. In the air above the school is a dark mark, a symbol swirling in the clouds, this snake-like figure. And as he lays there on the ground, with tears running down her face, Professor McGonagall raises her wand, and on the tip, the end, there's a light, one little light, and she points it upwards. Soon, others join in, each with their own little light in the darkness of death. Everybody joins in a sea of pointed lights at the dark. The mark above the sky, their fallen headmaster on the ground. Yet those little lights together, they form a very bright light. And that bright light, it disperses the cloud, wiping the darkness away, if only for a moment. It's the lights coming together. They scatter the darkness. And for me, that's a visual picture that kind of brings home more of a concrete visual of our little light, our lamps. They can be a bright light together. So how does our light serve? So we have principalizing priests. There are people in priestly roles, priestly expectations, and we have individuals that practice that. In that practice, they're going to need to be an example to the nations as a whole. So in that context of Torah, with authority, priests, and service, now we can view the instructions on what the land, but as we've started to address here on the Dusty Feet, this is a borderless kingdom. But what is it still supposed to look like, to reflect, to shed on God's way? So what's a borderless kingdom look like? In light of Torah, pun intended, what does this people group look like? And I think that Matthew 5-7, it begins to give us a peek into that, a look into what that could possibly be. And in that borderless land, our need to principalize part of the Torah, what do we do? I mean, these instructions about when you go poop outside the camp and bring a shovel with you to bury it, we don't have to do that. Our neighbors appreciate it. They're probably happier. But we do because we have things that take care of that. But there's going to be a lot more where it's going to be a bit more challenging. And Jesus starts us on this journey with this in the Sermon on the Mount. There's a point that Tim and John are discussing, and they bring up that it was one of the major context discussions of the day was who determined how you did what you did and how your principle was viewed. Okay? This is a big discussion, and I do appreciate that Tim and John bring up this Pharisee-Sadducee split, because I think we lose context in all of that. Just because we are so far down the road that we don't realize this is truly a very large split group, not just in religious leadership, but in the crowd, the people around, the people. These are people around the land that are choosing to follow either the train of thought and subsequent practices of the Pharisees or the Sadducees. It's funny, I asked this from a group that I'm with, and with no ideas or answers yet. But I wonder where various disciples were in the context that they grew up in, because, I mean, they had rabbis and they had synagogues. But I asked the question, I wonder how many were of which understanding and practice of which group, right? Pharisee or Sadducee. We have Thomas that at the end, in a room, after Jesus rose and he appears to the room, he still doubts. So is he still hanging on to that Sadduceic thought of no resurrection? Is there residual thinking still hanging on? Was that part of what was going on in his mind? If you never understood that about the varying trains of thoughts and the teachings from the leadership of the day, then it probably never did cross your mind. But I'll bet, now that you know, you're not surprised that it crossed mine. Oh, for another context point, we mentioned something before that the high priest was of the line of Aaron, right? And we know that Caiaphas is in that role at that time, right? We get that later in the story, and historical documents back that up as well. But Caiaphas was not of the line of Aaron. So we already have a huge challenge. Here's a huge part that's not in context, right? It doesn't need principalizing. It's just flat wrong. One of the things the Jewish people do very well is track lineages. They keep records of whom is from what lineage, what priestly roles, and the rotations of duty, okay? That's one of the ways we actually get a pretty good approximation of the birth of Jesus, right? Zechariah was a priest at the temple. He had duties that were part of the priestly rotation. And that's when those kind of records sometimes, they come in handy. And since, like Tim mentions, the Sadducees were the ruling political wing of the leadership, there's probably a good chance that Caiaphas is of that ilk as well, because he's appointed for such to placate Rome. I mean, no one wanted Rome in their business. They wanted no trouble. Keep our problems to ourselves, control what we can, keep Rome at arm's length. They are the power brokers for the people. But the people, they had no choice. So we have a high priest. That's not who he should be. We do have a temple. It's the second temple. But we also have other missing items, like that breastplate is gone, believed to be lost at the destruction of the first temple with that Babylonian invasion. Ark of the Covenant's gone as well, believed to be lost at the same. We find that out with the tearing of the veil, right? So what is, well, it's not what it's supposed to be. That can help us a bit on this context as we see Jesus addressing his leadership, because now we realize there's a lot going on underneath. But let's not lose focus. The majority of the time, Jesus is not addressing them. He's addressing the people, us, calling to repentance, us. And with the kingdom of God, this borderless kingdom that is starting as he spoke, what it could look like and what the citizens of the kingdom will look like. It literally hit me as I was typing this, and I'm not sure why I didn't notice it earlier. In reference to the priests, right? The picture in the land, right? We know that what we've done will need to be principalized. But let's go back to the original story. In the primary story, they were actually scattered around the land of Israel. They owned no land, no property. They had no lineage inheritance to pass down. They only had what God gave them and what he promised them. So as scattered in the diaspora, with even us as part, are we not in the same boat? I mean, so to speak, in a sense, because now we're in a borderless kingdom, us all of these priestly followers of God now scattered around. Should we expect this now same in the future? That's probably not the picture you had in your head. And one that it's probably not very popular, actually. But remember, Torah, and the story that continues to this day, it's still part of that. And the Torah system It also helped provide for them, those priests scattered about. It's a rather important part. And ironically, it's directly tied to those sacrifices. It was food and such, because it wasn't all about death. As Tim put it, I love this part, that the cultural context has radically shifted between the Torah when it was originally given to the people in the desert as the instructions for the land they were going to enter. But the land that they're sitting in at that time might be the space, but it's not theirs. It's a different place. We know the place fits, but the time's different. It's the choices, not unlike our very own, that made the bed that they're not liking that they're sleeping in. There's no way out. Again, with a mirror in hand, not like ourselves many times. But what we have following in this part of Matthew, after the Beatitudes, we have some following points, and then we're going to get to the parables. Yep, here will come the very things that we're going to need to practice that principalizing. Because parables, they're just stories that drive us to principalize, to take an instruction, apply it to a situation, to take a thought, possibly a meaning for some other thing, and apply it to another. Jesus' idea, they are not new, they're expansive. They're Torah in a borderless kingdom. The world, as they know it, from a God perspective, is about to get bigger. And those same instructions apply. So how does that work today? Because Jesus is just being Jesus. His parables are designed to be looked at through a Torah lens, a Torah concept. How would this work in these kind of situations? The Son of God telling us his Father's instructions. Because Torah, like Jesus said, it's not going away, but it will need to be looked at in a wider lens. Hate before murder. Lust before adultery. Nothing's going to change from it until heaven and earth cease. I don't think we're there yet. But as we get towards the end, I like how they said that Jesus came to fill them full, to fill in the Torah. Gaps had opened. Jesus was filling in the gaps. In terms of a glass, it's filled full. You know, if you watch any of the other little mini episodes that they have on the Bible Project, which I highly recommend, again, don't forget, the link is in the description to get the app, because it's going to put you on that weekly reading playlist, because it's brilliant. But in more than one video, they have this wonderful graphic. It's of a teacher, Jesus, and he's holding a Torah scroll. And from that scroll is a light. A glowing scroll, a reflecting light. And the teacher is going around and shining the light in the various gaps. The Torah is a light, and it's filling in the gaps. It's filling in the space. I just love the visual. You know, we're trying to get this answer. We're trying to figure this thing out. We're trying to figure that thing out. And then this light, it's shining in those gaps. You know, it's interesting, and I think we end up seeing, as we're filling in the gaps, that it's actually reflecting more on the heart, right? Maybe the gaps are driven by the hearts not being whole, them not being full. We hear that from the prophets. We hear that from Jesus. We get that from Torah, that they need to have a heart change. And Jesus is making it clear. We need a heart change. This is where he's shining his light. I love this quote from the video, and it was Tim's talking, right? He says, there are a set of texts that create momentum and expectation, a conflict that needs to be resolved in some way, and that's how Jesus reads the Bible as this unified story that needs resolution. That he's claiming here, I'm not here to provide the resolution. No, I am here to provide the resolution to which the Torah and the prophets are pointing. He's claiming, I am here to provide the resolution to which the Torah and the prophets are pointing. So as Tim and John pointed out, if it's not going away, if it's not being rendered useless or void, what do we do? How do we answer that? So we're going to continue with that, and we're going to see much more. And have you seen the teaser for episode 4? It's intriguing. And as you can tell, I'm really excited about this series. In our next video, it's probably going to be on episode 4. And of course, the day after, we're going to have that chat with my brother Jim Warren. We're going to explore even more in that. Remember, in the description below, there's a link to the folks at the Bible Project, a link to the app. So, because I want you to follow along. I want you to see each one as they premiere. I want you to see and listen to and hear and read all the additional topics that they discuss. Because this is going to continue to be an exciting and thought-provoking journey into the Sermon on the Mount. Because I just wonder where to continue to uncover. So thanks for with us tonight with the Sermon on the Mount on another edition of The Dusty Feet.